This is Japi, and welcome to Japi Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Professor Nandini Chatterjee from Kolkata, and I welcome you all to the JAPI podcast for the month of November 2024, Volume 72, Issue 11. This issue of JAPI has some really interesting articles, including 9 original articles, 4 review articles, 1 point of view, 3 unique case reports, and 1 letter of correspondence. So let's begin with the original articles. A very interesting study that we have now is the prevalence of celiac disease in patients with nutritional anemia in the western part of India. This study is by Archita Makharia et al. And as we know, data on the prevalence of celiac disease among individuals with nutritional anemia is very scarce. In this study, individuals with nutritional anemia were prospectively investigated for the presence of celiac disease with the detection of immunoglobulin A anti-TG antibody testing. Those who had a positive antibody result proceeded to have an upper GI endoscopy accompanied by a duodenal biopsy. They took around 116 patients, including 96 females, with a mean age of 37 years. Among them, 19 patients, that is about 16.3%, were positive for the IgA anti-TTG antibodies. Overall seroprevalence of celiac disease thus came out to be 16.3, while the biopsy confirmed prevalence stood at 9.3%. Chronic diarrhea and short stature emerged as significant predictors of celiac disease among patients with nutritional anemia. It was concluded from this study that even in the western part of India, approximately 1 in 10 patients with nutritional anemia had celiac disease. So consequently, they have opined that we should all screen patients with nutritional anemia for celiac disease by doing the antibody testing. And this is a very crucial thing that they have opined, because we did not have this awareness that celiac disease was so common and led to nutritional anemia so frequently among our patients. The next study to be described is called Prescribing Pattern and Effectiveness of Antihypertensives in Patients Suffering from Hypertension and Diabetes mellitus with and without compelling indications in a tertiary care hospital. This study is by Prajakta Vilash Jagdale et al. The objective of this study was to consider the prescribing pattern and effectiveness of antihypertensive agents in hypertensive and diabetic patients with and without compelling indications. They studied a total of 226 patients, and they found that the prescribed antihypertensive agents, beta blockers, were the most commonly prescribed, followed by angiotensin receptor blockers, calcium channel blockers, AC inhibitors, diuretics, and other classes. Combination therapy was predominantly used, with dual drug therapy being the most common. The compelling indications for antihypertensive treatment included ischemic heart disease in around 38.4%, chronic kidney disease in 12.3%, and stroke in 6.6%. It was found that BP control was achieved in 93% of the patients, with 85.9% having hypertension with diabetes, and 82.8% of the patients had additional indications along with the blood pressure. Therefore, it was concluded that antihypertensive medications prescribed to the study adhering to guidelines, and that long-term use of these combinations proved to be very effective, safe, and well tolerated for patients having both hypertension and diabetes. The next article that we have in November is Renal Biopsy Registry from a single center in India, a 20-year experience. This is by Chetan Veera Maneni. Now, this is an extensive study of renal biopsy which spanned for over 2 decades, and a total of 4,532 biopsies were evaluated in this study. It was found that the most common clinical presentation which led to renal biopsy was nephrotic syndrome, followed by nephritic-nephrotic combination, acute nephritic illness, APGN, unexplained AKI, CKD, and asymptomatic urine abnormalities. Histology revealed that the most common diagnosis was primary glomerulonephritis, 49.9%, followed by secondary glomerular diseases in 22%, tubulointerstitial disease in 20.8%, and vascular diseases much lesser, 3.3%. Minimal change disease, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and IgA nephropathy were commonest primary glomerular diseases. Diabetic nephropathy, on the other hand, was followed by lupus nephritis and hypertensive nephropathy were the three most common secondary causes of glomerular involvement. Now, the author has given very important 5 highlights of this study which needs to be discussed. Most common glomerular disease, which was primary, was minimal change disease. This was differing from reports in the West where IgA nephropathy is reported as the commonest glomerular nephritis. Biopsies for asymptomatic urinary abnormalities were found to be much less in our country in comparison to the Western world. In our study, diabetic nephropathy constituted 15.7% among all glomerular diseases, which is higher than the other nationwide registries and single center studies. This might be due to a more liberalized approach in considering diabetic patients for renal biopsy in this particular center. The incidence of amyloid in this study is lower than other registries, comprising only 3.3% of the total secondary glomerular diseases. Tubulointerstitial disease, on the other hand, was much more common in this registry than other global and Indian studies. So, to conclude, nephrotic syndrome and minimal change disease were the most common findings of renal biopsy in this study. However, it has been reported and concluded that there is an urgent need for a uniform nationwide biopsy registry in India so that we can get a picture of the various etiologies of renal disease, and regional differences are also analyzed. The next article is titled Achievement of ABC Goals in Type 2 Diabetes in Real Life by Hemraj Balchand Chandalia et al. This real-life observational study from a diabetes center in Western India reports the status of hemoglobin A1C, blood pressure, and cholesterol levels currently achieved in type 2 diabetic patients. A cohort of 497 patients of type 2 diabetes was studied for over a period between 2014 and 2017. A minimum of 2 follow-up clinical evaluations and investigations were done and analyzed. It was found that HbA1c dropped significantly in the whole cohort within this 3-year period. Increasing duration of diabetes showed a significantly poor achievement of HbA1c targets on follow-up, and ABC targets were at goal for HbA1c, high blood pressure, and low density lipoprotein in 17, 40, and 33% of the patients. On follow-up, it was found that percentage of patients at goal were higher, HbA1c 35%, hypertension 95%, and LDL cholesterol at 75.85%. Therefore, this study demonstrates the importance of following up your patients and monitoring their treatment regularly, so that there is importance of achieving the goals in the long run. The next article that we have is a fixed dose combination therapy of paracetamol, phenylephrine, and chlorpheniramine maleate for symptomatic treatment of common cold in Indian adults. Common cold is always being encountered by physicians when the patients come to them, and it is very important for them to offer some symptomatic benefit to the patients so they feel better. A total of 420 patients had been taken whose age ranged between 18 and 65 years, and they were evaluated for the efficacy and safety of this fixed dose combination of paracetamol, phenylephrine, and chlorpheniramine. They were studied for a duration of 5 days, and the patients had to visit the clinical trial site for the baseline visit on the first day and re-evaluation on third day and conclusion on fifth day. So it was concluded that the fixed dose combination was efficacious and safe for symptomatic treatment of common cold in the adults. Next study that we are going to describe is a study of the progression, complication, and outcome of mucormycosis in a case of coronavirus disease 2019 pneumonitis at a tertiary care center in Gujarat. The study is by Mit K. Makadia and al. This November issue, in fact, has a basket of 3 studies on the COVID-19 disease and its various clinical expressions. This particular study is retrospective study, included 100 cases of COVID-19 pneumonitis who developed mucormycosis during admission and stay at a COVID hospital in Rajkot during 2021 to 2022. The patients' clinical spectrum was studied, and they were all treated with amphotericin B, and their outcome was analyzed. Among the patients admitted to the hospital, it was showed that 40% showed evidence of mucormycosis after 21 to 30 days, with maxillary sinusitis being the most common presentation, as in 35%. It was also found that out of these patients, 72% required oxygen assistance in various forms. Also, 69% required steroids, 65% took antiviral medications, and 3% of them received tocilizumab. It is very important to note that in this particular study, 82% of patients survived. In other studies, the fatality rate is much more. So it is seen that these group of patients had a better outcome than others. Another study involving COVID-19 patients is a retrospective observational study to compare the clinical and lab parameters of patients requiring hospitalization during the third wave versus the second wave. This study is by Milind Sandeep Tak et al. This study aims to compare different clinical and lab parameters of hospitalized patients in Omicron-driven third wave versus Delta-driven second wave. In this study, 100 patients of third wave and second wave respectively requiring hospitalization were included. The primary outcome of the study was patient survival and condition at discharge, and secondary outcome was length of hospital stay and mode of oxygenation. It revealed that the presence of cough, shortness of breath, and loss of taste was more common in second wave. The severity of illness, need for ITU, and outcome in terms of discharge with or without oxygen was significantly more in the second wave versus the third wave. Omicron-driven third wave was associated with significantly less severity, less inflammatory response, and better outcome compared to the Delta-driven second wave. More vaccination and less intrinsic virulence during third wave has a major role in better outcomes. Another COVID-19 study that we have in this particular issue is a structured tele-based post-COVID-19 rehab program in the Indian population. This study is by Purvi Devani et al. This group was done to study and assess the impact of a structured tele-rehabilitation program in post-COVID-19 recovery in the Indian population. In this retrospective study spanning between August 2020 and May 2021 in Mumbai, they analyzed data from post-COVID survivors enrolled in tele-rehabilitation program. The study concluded that a structured tele-based program is a feasible yet effective approach and should be considered for the delivery of rehabilitation to patients who are unable to participate in center-based rehabilitation. Coming to the next article, we have an 8-year experience of gastrointestinal tuberculosis from a tertiary care hospital in North India by Brij Sharma et al. From January 2012 to December 2019, consecutive patients aged 12 years and older diagnosed with GI tuberculosis at a tertiary care center in North India were enrolled. Anti-tubercular treatment was administered and GI endoscopy was performed upon the completion of treatment. The most common presenting symptoms that were found were weight loss, abdominal pain, fever, and diarrhea. The ileocecal region was the most frequently affected site, around 76%, followed by segmental colonic TB. Most common finding on computed tomography was thickening of the bowel wall with or without local lymphadenopathy. The endoscopic lesions that were most commonly detected were ulcerations followed by nodularity, deformed cecum and ileocecal valve, and strictures. All the patients responded well to anti-tubercular treatment, and follow-up colonoscopy in 73.1% of the patients showed regression of lesions. This is a very heartening finding because gastrointestinal tuberculosis is often a challenge to diagnose, and since they have studied these patients for 8 years and gives quite a hopeful picture, it is important for Indian patients, as we all know, that tuberculosis is still a scourge to be dealt with in our country. The November issue also has a handful of interesting review articles. One of them is cognitive neurology, continuing medical education, history taking, and bedside mental status examination in patients with dementia by Amrita Jagdish Gatur et al. Now, dementia is a very common presentation in the neurology outpatient clinic, and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias constitute around 4.6% of the total neurological disorder disability adjusted life years in India in 2019. So, it has been understood that in order to diagnose a patient with suspected dementia, history taking, higher mental status examination, focused neurological examination, and very relevant investigations are required. Among the examinations to be done, higher mental function examination by the help of MMSE and MOCA are internationally validated cognitive screening batteries. The Hindi version of MMSE is also validated and available for use. The ICMR NCTB4 has validated the MOCA in 5 Indian languages, so that will help us in examining patients for suspected dementia. So, the author has described how history taking and various tools can be used to evaluate patients who have the suspected dementia. Knowledge of these tools should be there for every medicine or neurology residents for better patient care. Next, we have an narrative review. Topiroxostat, a safer uricostatic drug with enhanced renal protection by S. Chandrasekhara et al. A systemic literature search was performed to select relevant observational studies examining the renal outcomes in patients between 2005 and 2023 who were on topiroxostat, and they included people who were 18 years and older, were diagnosed with hyperuricemia with or without gout, and they had uric acid levels greater than 7 and a stable renal function. The study concluded that topiroxostat showed promise as an efficient and safe renoprotective agent in patients irrespective of renal disease status. However, further large-scale, long-term and multi-center clinical studies are needed to generate high-quality evidence. Another review article is about the management of acute pulmonary embolism by Abhay Bhave et al. Now, pulmonary embolism is a very important cause of morbidity and mortality among hospitalized patients, and it is important to note that we often miss the diagnosis and mismanagement often is the result. The main treatment in medical management of acute pulmonary embolism comprises anticoagulant and thrombolytics. According to the current guidelines, oral anticoagulants such as warfarin are recommended to be started at the time of diagnosis along with the unfractionated or low molecular weight heparins. The advantage of the newer anticoagulants without monitoring has been also mentioned. The final review article for this month is on stable angina pectoris, a review of pathophysiology, diagnosis and management by Anurag Sharma et al. Coronary artery disease and ischemic heart disease clinically present as angina pectoris, as we all know. Despite advances in treatment options for CAD, a lack of awareness of risk factors and disease, access to healthcare and affordability are the primary concerns in low and middle income countries. This review basically discusses different calcium channel blockers for the management of angina pectoris. Though we often use beta blockers and nitrates, as well as some second-line drugs like ivabradine, which is also in usage. So friends, this is the November basket of articles for you from JAPI. I'm sure they have succeeded in enlightening you with the Indian perspective of many diseases, which is the need of the hour, to enhance research work from this part of the world. Thank you.